we start for the second part, the part dedicated to the Kanizsa lecture. Just say a few words, and then the rector of the University of Trieste will deliver the official welcome speech before the lecture by Barbara GILLAM. Also, on behalf of other organizers, Carlo Fantoni and Paolo Bernardis, I would like to thank the organization and institution who helped us to have this event, the Kanizsa lecture and the Trieste Symposium on Perception and Cognition, which is the framework within which the Kanizsa lecture takes place. So first of all, the University of Trieste for support in different ways and different levels, the Department of Life Sciences, the Italian Association for Psychology, and the province of Trieste. The province is also the hosting institution in this theater. It's one of the buildings of the former psychiatric hospital of Trieste, still owned by the province of Trieste. And this is the reason we are here today. I will tell you more about our speaker, but we must really thank Barbara GILLAM for accepting the invitation to be here. She comes from Sydney. She had a very long journey to arrive here, also with some complication, as usual, with luggage, but everything went well at the end, so you will be able to appreciate also stereo vision with the glasses that were in her luggage in Singapore, left for some time. And now the word to the microphone to the rector for the welcoming speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walter. Thank you very much to you all to be here. A big welcome to all of you, and specifically to our guests from Australia, which is just on the other side of the earth, which is very interesting and important. I'm not an expert in your field, actually. I'm an engineer, so really what I can say is that what we breathe here today is an atmosphere of internationalization, and this is actually one of the road and one of the main goal of my administration and the direction that this rectorate is going to have in the next years. We already started very well in this direction by setting up a fantastic relationships with the surrounding countries. Talking about the Danube area, but not only the Danube area, also the Alpine area. Trieste is a very peculiar town and is now located in a very particular position, geographical position, I mean, which is also a political position due to the fact that the border is not here anymore. And actually, when we think about the location of Trieste, it used to be a marginal location with respect to Italy, very close to the border. Very difficult situation, but now it's really a fantastic location because this is just in the center of Europe. And talking about possibility also of getting, let's say, a research fund for performing research in different areas, Trieste is just the center of three macro region of interest of European Union, and it's the Adriatic-Ionic region, which of course includes the Balkans and includes also part of the all Italy and part of Greece and Albania, as well as the Danube region, as well as the Alpine region. And if you look at these three different regions, they converge right to Trieste. And there's going to be a lot of money involved in structural funds in Europe in this area, in these three areas. So we actually have to establish more and more contacts with research centers, universities, different entities, industries in particularly in these three areas, but keeping really an eye also to other area, and perhaps, I don't know, Australia, even if it's not yet a member of the EU. I'm just kidding, of course, but the possibility of establishing a good relationship with places which are far away from here geographically, but very close to here, let's say virtually, I think this is going to be a very good opportunity. So, again, I thank you all very much for being here, and I wish you a great success, and I'm sorry I really have to leave. I would have loved to stay here like last year and learn a little bit about your field, but I'm busy in another meeting that is going to start in 5 minutes. So thank you again for being here, and thank you again to you, and welcome to Trieste. Thanks.
Grazie. So before I thank the institutions and a few persons, but now it's time also to thank all authors and active participants in the Trieste Symposium, because this year for the first time we made an effort, a collective effort, which was publishing online the proceedings, and we succeeded in that, in having the proceeding done. They are ready today, and tomorrow there will be also some printed copies available. And this was possible only because all participants were really good in sending the text, and they were fast in responding. So we were very happy as organizer of having produced this object. And connected to that, we also thank the personnel of the publishing house of the University of Trieste, the EUT, who collaborated in zero time to produce this object that will be our production, I think, for this year and for future years. And we also thank an external agency, Divulgando, who provided the graphical work as a sponsorship to our event. So it's a rather unusual and very appreciated fact. The things that you see, the poster you see, and the graphics of the online proceedings are from Divulgando, are by Divulgando. Okay. So the first contribution in these proceedings, which is also something special, is the translation of the 1954 short paper, which was also a proceeding, where Kanizsa first published the famous Kanizsa triangle. Well, it was called just a spatial effect, a phenomenon, the triangle. The year after, Kanizsa published a long paper on that, which is the paper mostly cited in 55. But the original proceeding from the Chianciano Terme meeting of Italian psychologists was published in 54, exactly 60 years ago. So we are celebrating here in Trieste this year because it is a special year for the city of Trieste. It was at the beginning of October of 60 years ago, the Memorandum of Understanding of London was signed, and the city became officially Italian after 9 years of British occupation, or British government, let's say, British and American, and New Zealanders and Australians, those people very far, yeah. And, but for scientifically, for us at least, for our group, 54 is a special, very special year because two papers appeared by Kanizsa, one on contrast and gradient, marginal gradient, the other on assimilation. So, and this proceeding that you will find translated in English and available to the international community this year for the first time. In some sense, this is also the reason we invited Barbara, because Barbara work, at least part of Barbara's work, is really strictly connected to the topic of that short proceeding, which was the topic of finding a line of, a logical line of connection between phenomena in grouping of dots making constellations by collinearity and other factors, and some special effects of figure ground segregation in regions of homogeneous stimulation. This was the idea. So related to the splitting between an occluding, an illusory occluding figure and a background, something that will be fully developed in the talk that Barbara will deliver. I had the privilege of meeting Barbara several years ago in New York, and Irv Rock introduced me to Barbara. They were close friends. By the way, Irv Rock was the first speaker of our long list of speakers at the Kanizsa lecture in '93. I think it's nice to remember that, because Barbara, Irv, Ken Nakayama, a selected group within the speakers, really belong to the hard group of vision scientists that made the recent history of this field. Barbara is one of these big scientists in this area. And for this reason, I'm really glad to leave the stage to Barbara and thank her again, because I remember in the 70s when the early 80s when I met her personally first. I remember her as a dedicated scientist, enthusiastic, productive, and enchanting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walter. Well, thank you very much, Rector and Walter. It's wonderful to be back in Trieste. I was here, I think it was in the late 80s, for a couple of months. I really liked the city very much, and so my colleagues in the psychology department, but particularly I enjoyed sharing an office with Kanizsa, who was retired at the time, but used to come in one day a week. And he didn't use his office very much, and so it was suggested that I might like to share it, and that was fantastic. We had a modus operandi of communication in which he spoke to me in German. I did German at school, and I don't speak it very well, but I sort of understand it. And I spoke to him in English, and he doesn't speak English really very well, but he understands it. So we managed to communicate, and I'm very pleased to say that I created this lecture with him very much in mind, with really the kinds of areas that I've worked on that were of interest to him. And maybe grouping, he considered himself a Gestalt psychologist, of course. His great book actually mentions Gestalt psychology in the title. And when I was sharing the office with him, I actually talked about the grouping work I'm going to mention today, which is quite old. And because it was a bit out on left field relative to what was going on in the grouping field, as you'll see when I give my talk. And he was very, very encouraging about it. And I appreciated that very much. He really liked it. So that's another reason to include that. And I'll also talk about occlusion, which is related to subjective contours and amodal completion, and art, and all of these things were of great interest to Kanizsa. He published some papers that are not translated on art and perception. Okay, so I'll start. First slide, please. Oh, sorry, there's a slide before that. Oh dear, something's gone wrong. Well, let's forget about the introductory slide. I'll just go straight into the lecture. So basically, I've got four main topics. I mean, the first one is a discussion of the major concepts of grouping, and a slightly critical discussion of the major concepts of grouping, suggestion of that maybe there are some important areas that have been overlooked. The second aspect of my talk will deal largely with occlusion and try to relate that to some extent to what I say about grouping. The third part of my talk, which will probably be after the break, is stereoscopic work on occlusion, and that's some very interesting phenomena associated with stereoscopic occlusion, which are really important for theory. And finally, I'll talk about art, and particularly occlusion in art, and take up Kanizsa's point that the depiction of occlusion is an incredibly neglected field in the discussion of perception and art, completely neglected, and because people think it's cognitive, and he thought it was perceptual, which I agree with. Okay, to get to the first topic, which is major concepts of grouping. Actually, I think I'll sit down because I want to be able to see the slides. Okay. Well, first of all, the definition of grouping, which is quite a recent definition, but also is the same definition that the Gestalt psychologists basically had, which is that grouping is the fact that observers perceive some elements of the visual field as going together more strongly than others. And this is a quote from a recent paper by a lot of the luminaries in the grouping field, or with Wagemans, who's a very important figure now in resurrecting Gestalt concepts as the first author. So then the second major concept of grouping is that, which also dates back to Gestalt psychology, of course, is that grouping results in emergent features, that is, properties of the group that are different from the sum of the parts. That's the most well-known maxim of Gestalt psychology. And then there's pregnance, that the visual system sees the best figure possible under current conditions. And best is usually interpreted as the most simple or the most regular figure possible. And simplicity and regularity have been quantified in various ways. I'm not going to go into the details of that. Actually, I'm not sure that this microphone, is this going in and out of volume? I'm just worried about the angle. Is it okay? All right. Okay. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, I think that there are several distinctions that are largely absent from traditional as well as current treatments of grouping. And the first is grouping as the segmentation of elements versus grouping as the cohesion of elements or parts. And, the definition that I just read you, talks about some things going together more than others. So it's about segmentation, segregation. And the second distinction, which is largely ignored, or I don't think people even recognise that it's an issue, is grouping as unit formation, which is units produce emergent features, versus grouping as aggregation, which is a form of grouping without emergent features. And I'll describe that in a minute. I'll operationally define these concepts, and I'll also show that grouping isn't an all or nothing thing, that elements can be grouped for some perceptual responses and ungrouped for others. And finally, I'll show that grouping doesn't always obey pregnance. Next, please. So these are the famous Wertheimer Gestalt grouping principles with two extra ones at the bottom. I got this figure from Rock and Palmer, and they were responsible for the newly proposed laws at the bottom. The Gestalt laws are proximity, similarity, closure, good continuation, common region, and connectedness. And they all illustrate the relative definition of grouping given by Wagemans et al. 2012 that I just mentioned. That is, the grouped elements appear to go together more strongly than others. So, for example, these are grouped because they go together more than either of them goes with the others in the row. But there's nothing within a segregated or segmented pair that indicates whether it is or is not a group in any absolute sense. So if I took that pair away from all the rest, well, all you could say is that it's got similarity, but you couldn't really say that it was a group in any interesting sense. To say that two isolated things are a group would require some evidence for cohesion within the group. Next, please. Now, Kafka, who was, of course, one of the greatest of the Gestalt psychologists, and Beck, who did a lot of very good early work on texture segmentation, both acknowledged that the processes of segmentation and the processes of cohesion, and these were Kafka's own terms, are confounded. Confounded both in the demonstration, in the Gestalt grouping demonstrations, and also confounded in experiments, because search tasks and so on could be based on both segmentation and cohesion, and it's hard to tease them apart. So criteria for pure cohesion are needed, and these should be restricted to the elements themselves or the parts themselves, rather than just demonstrating their distinctiveness from a context. And one such criterion is to show that the grouped elements behave alike with respect to an ambiguous property. Next. And this is one of my favourite examples of some ambiguous elements that are cohesively grouped, and these are the Atnev triangles. Now, these triangles are only two-dimensional, but they actually appear to point. They all point in a certain direction, and that they point in the direction of one of their axes. And if you keep looking at them, then they all change and point in a different direction towards another one of their axes. Now, this is cohesive grouping. These joint reversals show a grouping because there's some kind of connection which links these elements. They're not just a cluster, like a heap of garbage or something. But there's no emergent feature. Removing any element doesn't influence the appearance of the rest, which is a property of an emergent feature. So this kind of grouping I call aggregation and not unit formation. Next. Another means of another form of ambiguity which can be used to actually measure cohesive grouping is what's called rotational linkage. Now this is a motion kind of stimulus. So basically, if you take oblique lines, they have to be oblique because we simulate rotation in depth for these lines around the central vertical axis to give rise to a strong kinetic depth effect. That is, even though it's simulated on a computer, you see these lines rotate. And the reason for that is the kinetic depth effect. With an oblique line, if it changes both length and orientation at the same time, it appears three-dimensional, it appears to rotate. So if you have a parallel projection, which is equivalent to looking at something very far away or something very small, this causes the direction of rotation in the kinetic depth effect, clockwise or counterclockwise, to be completely ambiguous. And reversals are common under those conditions. So the interesting thing here is if you took several lines, several rotating lines, and you can vary all sorts of properties of them, relative and properties and other properties, the question is, do they appear to rotate in the same direction? Do they reverse together? Because remember, they're ambiguous. And so the degree to which they rotate in the same direction is an index of their cohesion. Next. That's a movie to give you an idea of the kinetic depth effect. You have to, it didn't work. Could you just press the, I don't know, could you just press that? I can't do it. Oh yes, there it goes. So you can see that the lines appear to rotate. Now these particular lines actually go in opposite directions a great deal of the time. Okay, so do you get the idea? Next. So cohesive grouping can be quantified by the degree of rotational linkage over time of two or more rotating lines. Subjects are required to depress a switch whenever they see the two lines, or maybe one of a number of lines, appear to be rotating in opposite directions, and we call that fragmentation. This fragmentation time is accumulated usually over about 10 rotations, which is about 120 seconds. And the greater the fragmentation time, the less the cohesion of the lines is assumed to be. Next. Now this gives you an idea of some of the kinds of lines that we use. The axis of rotation is shown as a dotted line, but that wasn't actually present on the screen. So this looks at similarity. So here we have the lines vary from parallel here to opposite orientations, 15 plus 15 and minus 15 degrees from the horizontal to here, which gives almost chance cohesion. About almost half the time they're going opposite directions, which is what you'd get by chance if each of them was ambiguous. And there's a monotonic increase in fragmentation as the difference in orientation increases. Next. Now, I did look at parallel lines, but and I found that parallel lines cohere, they aggregate really. I mean, they go in the same direction as each other most of the time, as you saw on that graph. But if you make them strongly separate, if you increase the separation from what I showed on that graph, they do start to fragment. Even parallel lines start to fragment. But for most of the work I'm going to talk about today, I use the converging lines, which have very little grouping, very little cohesion. And I looked at various factors to see what I could do, what I and my colleagues could do to increase the grouping, to increase the cohesion. Next. The first factor is symmetry. Now, these are symmetric, but symmetry doesn't do anything for them because, as you saw in the movie, they go in opposite directions a great deal of the time. So symmetry doesn't really group them. It doesn't make them cohere. However, if you make the symmetry redundant, the grouping increases. I'm sorry I don't have the actual data for this. I didn't bring it for some stupid reason. But anyway, the amount of fragmentation here is significantly greater than it is here and here. So it isn't symmetry as such, it's redundant symmetry that increases coherence of those lines. And when they become coherent, for most of the time, as here, they develop an emergent feature which is perspective, so that now there's a longer side and a shorter side, and they behave rather like an Ames window, with the longer side during rotation always in the nearer two quadrants. So this emergent feature of perspective produces an oscillation, whereas a single line that's not grouped will just more or less randomly reverse. Next. Now this is an interesting thing that we discovered, which is figure axis. Now this is not altogether surprising. We know that from a lot of other work on symmetry, that symmetry around a vertical axis, as here, is more powerful. You can detect it better, and there's lots of data showing that it's a more significant factor in human perception than symmetry around a horizontal axis. And you can see that's true here, that for this experiment, there was very little fragmentation for the lines when they were symmetric around a vertical axis, but were compared to when they were symmetric around a horizontal axis. Next slide. But the really interesting thing about this is that this is an entirely retinal effect. It's not distal. So that's true when the subject's vertical, but if the subject switches their head to a horizontal position, the situation completely reverses. So now this one, which is now retinally like this one, has a very small. When the subject's horizontal, I mean this one becomes retinally symmetric around the vertical and gets a very small fragmentation, whereas this one becomes symmetric around the vertical and has a very large fragmentation. So, in fact, this is really interesting, the kind of interesting things that you can discover in looking at simple cohesive grouping. And I won't go into the details, there's a whole lot of phenomena that show retinal orientation rather than distal orientation control, but I'm not going to go into the details of that. This is an overview of the kinds of things that you can do in studying cohesive grouping. Next. Now this is our attempt to look at common region, which is one of the new grouping principles introduced by Rock and Palmer. So what we did was we took the lines which fragment a lot, and we surrounded them by a frame which also rotated in a planar fashion with the lines. I mean, they all rotated in synchrony, and of course this is the fragmentation time for the lines on their own, which in this case was about 35 seconds, and these two had significantly less fragmentation, but not much. I mean, they fragment about 24, 25 seconds, so it's not much of an advantage to put a frame around them. But when the frame goes to a common vanishing point with the lines, that's a different matter. Then the fragmentation decreases enormously, so it's now only about 11 seconds compared to 35 seconds. So the degree to which there's coherence of the lines produced by a common region depends upon the common region having a vanishing point in common with the lines. Next slide, please. And we did a control for that, because it could just have been that the reason why these lines were had their fragmentation reduced was that they were grouped by parallelism with a closed figure. So we had a control for that. We introduced an internal closed figure which was also parallel to the lines, and that did not reduce the fragmentation. So in fact it was the surrounding frame that was responsible for the reduction in fragmentation. Next. And we call these inlines. If you insert lines between the fragmenting lines, it greatly reduces the fragmentation. If you have a look at the top, I don't know whether you can see the figures, but this is, for this particular experiment, this fragmentation here was 66 seconds, was reduced with even one inline to 12.3 seconds, and for 3 inlines to 4.2 seconds. And that was not due just to a reduction in the separation of the lines, because if you took this figure and just used two line components of it that had the same separation as the figure as a whole, there was significantly more fragmentation. We did a number of experiments on inlines actually, and I won't go into details, but the effect is not just because of a decrease in separation, although that has some effect, but it's also because of the redundancy of vertical edge alignment. The more that this edge alignment is redundantly specified, the less the fragmentation, and also the vanishing point's very important. If these lines are made to be of the same orientations, the same number, but not go to a vanishing point, the fragmentation increases quite a lot. So there are a whole lot of factors here that produce grouping of lines when there are elements between them that are those that kind of start to specify a surface, the presence of a surface, which was something that J.J. Gibson was very interested in, as you may know. Next. Now, closure is a very interesting one. This is very painful, pressing this button. So what we did here was we had completely closed figures and completely open figures, and then other figures where there was a gap which varied, and really extraordinarily, the fragmentation time of the upper and lower components here increased monotonically with the size of the gap. And I think we were the first to show, really, although other people have shown it since, the closure is just not an all or nothing thing. And of course, pregnants can't really explain this kind of effect because, I mean, the best figure for any gap is surely a coherence rather than the lines going in opposite directions. And the reason why, you might wonder why there are stalks on those lines, and the reason for that is that I did a lot of this. This is very old work, and it was done before you could do smoothly moving things on computer screens, and these were actually wire figures made by the engineering department at Columbia University, and they were actually rotated, and the subjects watched silhouettes of them on a shadow caster, and the parallel projection was produced by a large collimating lens and so on. That's why they've got stalks. Next. Good continuation. If you have two separate Ames windows rotating with opposite perspective, they've got opposite perspective. Well, what happens is, of course, the longer side, it always appears in the nearer quadrants, and you get oscillation, as you always do for an Ames window. So you get these are two figures that are actually oscillating in opposite directions from each other. But if you align their vertical edges, and if they're reasonably proximate, they become a single trapezium shape, and they no longer they behave as a unit. They reverse together. They no longer oscillate at all because they've lost their perspective. And so, in a way, their emergent feature is a loss of perspective and the formation of a trapezium, which now behaves more randomly than the parts. Next. Now, this is a particularly interesting one. This is what happens when you rotate collinear lines, and they can be quite widely separated, and they'll still rotate in the same direction. But what happens next, as you make them far apart, they no longer seem to rotate around a common center, a common axis of rotation. They take on separate axes of rotation. It's as if the visual system can't manage to relate lines to a single axis of rotation when they're far apart. And if the lines are each take on a separate axis of rotation, they no longer appear as a rigid unit. They slip sideways across the screen. Because, I mean, they're really rotating around this axis. So to be consistent with these other axes, they have to actually move laterally as well. And so what we have here is a situation next. So here's the measure of coherent direction of rotation, or the grouping measure. And here's the measure of rigidity, which we took in a different experiment. And you can see that subjects had to press the button when the figure became non-rigid, and you can see that the figure is still aggregated for direction of motion at the same time that it's actually non-rigid. So this really shows that you can have grouping for one property, which is direction of rotation, and not for another, which is axis of rotation. Next. So to summarise cohesive grouping, the cohesive grouping work, first of all, aggregation. This is something that I don't think was very obvious before, that there is a form of cohesive grouping which the parts may aggregate for depth and motion, but without emergent features, and this occurs for parallel lines and collinear lines. And we also found that aggregation can apply to some percepts and not others, like, as I just said, direction of rotation and not rotation axis. Now, what function could aggregation have? Well, it seems to be a response to element redundancy and allows depth and or motion to be resolved in common for the group. And this is a very efficient thing for the visual system to do, based on similarity, to apply a common motion or depth resolution. Next. Now, cohesive grouping can also result in unit formation, as in most of the examples I've shown you, indicated by the presence of an emergent feature that causes the behaviour that's different from the parts. And this occurs for the converging lines under conditions of closure, common region, inlines, etc., most of the things I talked about. And the emergent feature is perspective, and the change in behaviour that causes is oscillation, or in some cases, yes, oscillation. Now, I think that one cannot conclude that it is the possibility of forming a unit with an emergent feature that produces cohesion. It's difficult to tease apart the order of things, but I would suggest that I think that cohesion occurs, and then the unit is formed secondarily as a result of the cohesion, and the cohesion is not formed because of the possibility of the unit. Next. Separation, a degree of rotational linkage of two linked lines decreases monotonically with their increased separation. I showed that for closure, but it's also true of parallel lines. And it's also true of those Ames window figures and the good continuation that the fragmentation starts to enter in if you move those good continuation Ames windows far apart. Now, separation effects, as I've already said, are difficult to account for with pragnants because they're not. What would be the best figure doesn't really change very much with separation, at least not with small separations, and usually the effect is monotonic with separation. And these effects do not seem to be low level because the effect of separation is always relative to line length, and we've done quite a lot of work in showing that. And this means that the grouping would show constancy, so it would be maintained with changes in distance because it's relative. The effect of separation is relative to line length. This would seem, anyway, the separation effect would seem to have an ecological basis, and so some form of the likelihood principle rather than the good figure principle or the simplicity principle would seem to apply. And there's lots of forms of the likelihood principle, as everybody knows, because they're starting with Helmholtz and ending with Bayes' theorem, and I'm not going to go into the details of that, but that seems to be the case. It's an ecological kind of effect. Next. I just want to make some general comments on grouping as a result of of the work that I've described. Now, grouping is usually presented as a single process, this is the case. There's a renaissance in grouping research, an interest in grouping now, and it's still presented that way, as if there is something called grouping. And the main research question in this area is still the relative strengths of grouping laws or principles, like the ones I showed you at the beginning of my talk, using the segmentation criteria. I mean, is proximity more powerful than similarity and so forth, that sort of question. However, principles or laws are not suitable descriptions for cohesive grouping, which varies quantitatively as a function of a range of parametric influences, such as separation and redundancy of various properties. And I would say that many of the cohesion determinants that we've talked about, and we've done quite a lot of other work as well, they're not amenable to study by segregative criteria. And examples are the effects of edge alignment, vanishing point, retinal axis, and so on. But the point I really want to make most strongly is that the use of a single term, such as grouping, tends to have a reifying effect. that is a lumping together of multiple kinds and functions of perceived connections and arrangements. I mean, I've chosen to look at the grouping of lines, but that's just one possible. There's all sorts of other things one could look at the grouping of, and you know, I don't claim that's the only form of cohesive grouping. It just happens to be what we've looked at, and so I think that perception has a very bad tendency to do this kind of reification, perception research. And a good example is depth cues. I think grouping principles have become rather like depth cues. And the depth perception is my main area of perception, and depth cues are my bête noire. I mean, they've been around since Descartes. They're listed in textbooks and treated as if they're entities, and the main question is to look at how they're weighted in relation to each other, just like the grouping principles. And this is ridiculous because things like stereopsis and motion parallax are not single cues. They're whole complexes of information, and to try to treat them as a single thing and just look at their relative importance is ridiculous. And I think the same thing is true of grouping principles. Next. Okay, I now turn to occlusion perception, which richly depends on various kinds of grouping. Next. And first of all, I'll talk about two-dimensional grouping and occlusion. I'll later talk about three-dimensional aspects of grouping, as I mentioned. And what I'll do in this section of my talk is I'll show how closure and possibly pregnance can be important determinants of perceiving occlusion. I mean, I know I was critical of pregnance in explaining the separation effect. That doesn't mean I'm throwing it out altogether. I'll show how occlusion is seen when an edge property contrasts in some way with the grouping of the elements edged. And more radically, I'll show that an orderly edge contrasting with poor inducer grouping can be an even more important indicator of occlusion. And I'll discuss the relative importance of cues to occlusion operating on one side of a surface edge and those operating across the surface in eliciting perception of occlusion and subjective contours. And this brings me to the point that I'll often use subjective contours as the measure of perceived occlusion strength. And I can justify that because we've done a number of experiments in which we've actually measured perceived occlusion with one group of subjects and measured subjective contours with the same stimuli minus a bounding line with another group of subjects. We get enormously high correlations. And subjective contours have the advantage as a measure of perceived occlusion that they are less likely to be cognitive. And people tend to, if you just ask people, does this appear more occluded than that in a paired comparison experiments? Some people who don't like whatever data you get, they're likely to say, oh, but that's just cognitive. People think it looks more like an occluded thing, whereas subjective contours are less likely to be cognitive. So they form a very good kind of index of perceived occlusion. Next. So first of all, I'll talk about occlusion and amodal completion by closure. This is, you'll all recognise this pyramid at the Louvre. And what I've done is I've given just the lines here, which are at the occluding edge and the occluding edge. And you can see, I think, that these lines do not appear to be occluded at all strongly, and they do not appear to amodally complete behind the edge at all strongly. And this would lead one to think, looking at the pyramid, that closure might be responsible for the very much greater increase in perceived occlusion and amodal completion here. And of course you could say, oh no, it's not that, it's just that it's the Louvre and it's a pyramid. Anyway, next. So I've got a series of figures here where I just put two lines and a potentially occluding circle. And you can see that when these lines form closed figures, that the degree of perceived occlusion and amodal completion considerably increases. Next. So we did an experiment on this using the method of paired comparison, which I've found it a very useful method for looking at fairly subjective impressions like subjective contours or perceived occlusion. What you do is you take a group of figures, in this case there were only 4, and you present each one with each other one multiple times and to multiple subjects, and you you can present them sequentially, or you can present them you present each one with each other one as a pair. You can present them, sequentially or simultaneously, but varying the order, and you end up with a probability that any one of the stimuli is chosen over all the rest, and you can turn that into Z-scores, but I tend to keep it as a probability. So here we have pairs with T-junctions about a pair of parallel lines, and these T-junctions are either closed or not closed. And the interesting thing, we for some reason we decided to use these figures which only have T-junctions in the middle and have L-junctions at the end, and you can see that the T-junctions are actually quite important. There's a combination of T-junctions and closure that's important. So when the T-junctions are present at the ends of the lines as well as in the middle, these two figures, you get much stronger occlusion than when the figures ended with L junctions. But anyway, in either case, in this case and in this case, the closed figures give a stronger sense of occlusion. Next. And when the lines are removed, closure at the outer edges enhances seeing a subjective contour along the gap. So you see subjective contours there more strongly than here. And we've also got a lot of data on that, but I won't give you that because I don't have time. But seeing a subjective contour here allows a closed figure to form behind the occluder, and that enhances the subjective contour. Next. Now, there have been claims, and this is related to the talk we heard earlier this morning, that amodal completion may be determined by good figure rather than just by continuation of contours or local continuations across an occluder. And this was what we heard in the talk a couple of talks ago, which was a very interesting talk, I thought. This is demonstrated in von Leer's lab mainly by subjects' drawings of partially hidden figures and by priming and by the methods we heard about today, so that you could have a local continuation, or you could have a more good figure kind of resolution of what's behind here. And all of these have both a local and not good figure resolution, which is based on continuation, and one that's more regular, good figure. Now, Kelman has argued that completions that are not based on relatability are cognitive rather than perceptual, and they're based on what he calls recognition on the basis of partial information. So he acknowledges that people do choose these kind of good figures as opposed to the more local continuations, but he says that that's not really perceptual. It's based on recognition using partial information. So we've done some work next. We've done some work on this to look at the property of symmetry. Now, in these figures, I mean, the local continuation is equally possible in this row and in this row, but symmetry is only possible for the upper row if one sees continuation behind below the line. Those figures are asymmetric and not good figures, do not obey pregnance, unless one sees this line as an occluder, and then one can see a symmetric figure continuing behind the occluder. And that could be, it could be cognitive. So this is where the use of subjective contours is very useful. So we produced a subjective contour version of this, and you can see, I think, that there's a much stronger subjective contour here than there is here. Next. We did an experiment using the method of paired comparison again, and we showed that, in fact, these figures that are tilted and are asymmetric unless seen to continue behind an occluder have a much stronger subjective contour than the figures that are symmetric without occlusion and completion and continuation behind the contour. And we also did it for these triangles where there's no local solution, because you can't continue these triangles and into completion. But nevertheless, we got stronger subjective contours for the asymmetric ones than for the symmetric ones, because these could form symmetric figures if continued behind the occluder. Next. Oh, well, I won't bother with that, because I don't think I have time. Just trying to. This just is the results of another paired comparison experiment showing that these circles have a higher probability of being seen with strong subjective contours than these regular figures here. Next. But are the stronger effects in the bottom row here really due to a tendency to impose pregnance? Another way of looking at pregnance types effects is to regard these edges here as extrinsic to the figure. Next. So that, for example, the edges of these figures here are extrinsic to the figure in the sense that they're not parallel to or orthogonal to the major axes of the shapes, whereas the regular figures had edges parallel to the major axes of the shapes and orthogonal to the major axes of the shapes. Similarly, here the bottom edges are straight while the figure is otherwise curved. And so when a set of such potentially extrinsic edges is aligned, their extrinsic status is reinforced and occlusion is seen. And of course, when a physical line is absent, a subjective contour is the mark of a perceived occlusion. And so what I would say here is that this is not it looks like pregnance, but it's not really a tendency to try to impose a regular figure. It's just that the cues are present in these figures that the edges are potentially extrinsic to the rest of the figure. Next. Next. Now, you can see with grouped lines that you can also get strong effects of extrinsic edges. So here we have a curved edge to a set of highly grouped parallel lines, which looks extrinsic and looks like an occlusion. Similarly, there's curvature contrast. Similarly, this is orientation contrast. And interestingly, an edge that's orthogonal to a set of lines does not appear extrinsic. There's some sort of grouping associated with an orthogonal edge that makes it seem part of the figure rather than extrinsic. Next. And this is just a photo by Ben Shahn showing a whole lot of edges, occluding edges, which have orientation and curvature contrast relative to the background. Whereas the gaps that are orthogonal to the lines and parallel to the edges of the figure show, for both densities, the least strong subjective contour along the gap. whereas the ones where the gaps extrinsic to the lines or to the grouping of the lines show, for both densities, stronger subjective contours. Next. Now, we also found that pore grouping can be very important, as I mentioned earlier, in giving a sense of occlusion. And that is because an occluding surface cuts off anything behind it. This is another Ben Shahn horrible photograph, sorry. He took photographs with the depression. But anyway, you can see that this rod here, is cutting off a huge variety of stuff, all sorts of contours at all sorts of angles and so on, because that's what an occluder does. It can occlude anything. Next. And so, conversely, what we've shown is that an aligned cutoff of disordered and poorly grouped elements is actually a very strong occlusion cue. Next. So here you can see this for contours that are highly disordered, that the smooth alignment contrasts with the disorder of the figure, or the entropy of the figure, to give a rather strong subjective contour compared to the similar alignment of a set of regular lines. And similarly, if you have two sets of them with a gap between them, you get a very strong sense of subjective contours along the gap, with the disorderly lines much stronger than with a set of orderly lines. So this is actually entropy contrast, we call it, because there's a low entropy of collinear endpoints contrasting with high entropy of the lines themselves. Next. And we've also found that a set of lines of high entropy seen within a rectangular shape appear to be looked at through a hole. This around here looks like an aperture through which you're looking at lines through a hole, much more than here, which just seems like a single object. And if you take away the lines, you can see that you get strong subjective contours on the edges of this disorderly figure, which again makes it look like a set of lines viewed through an aperture. Next. Actually, I don't know, how am I going for time? How long have I been talking for? Sorry?
You are in the middle. It's 20 minutes to 6. You are in the middle of your...
Okay, all right. Okay. Okay, so with this whole perception kind of phenomenon, you can vary the entropy within the rectangle. So this has got no entropy, and this has got an average of 15-degree difference between the lines, and this is an average of 25-degree difference between the lines. And what we found, again, using the method of paired comparisons, was an increase in the degree to which subjects said they saw this as a whole with a degree of entropy. That's the mean absolute orientation. So as entropy increased, subjects said more and more strongly that they saw this rectangular outline as an aperture and the lines viewed through a hole. Next. And again, we took the aperture away, and this time we did another paired comparison experiment in which we looked to see, we presented each degree of entropy with each other, and took a measure of the strength of subjective contour, and found that, again, that increases also with line entropy. So entropy is a very powerful controller of perceived occlusion. The greater the entropy, the more you see occlusion in the form of a hole or a subjective contour. Next. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in connection with 2D occlusion perception is the fact that there are two kinds of 2D occlusion cues. And a number of the things that I've shown you so far in this section of my talk, they've been inducers on both sides of a gap, and in some cases just on one side, just a set of inducers with no continuation on the other side. And we decided that we would actually try to systematically look at the effectiveness of these different kinds of cues. And you can see in this photograph that there are a number of occlusions where there's no continuation on the other side of the occluder. In some cases there is continuation, as here, but there isn't here, for example. And there isn't here. There isn't here. So it's quite common for occlusion to only be one-sided. And in order to look at that, we actually looked at art. Next. This was a slightly tedious exercise. I had a student interested in art take the catalogue of the National Gallery in London and just look at the sections of the catalogue dealing with realistic period in art, which is for some hundreds of years, and to take every third painting and to analyse it for occlusion events. So every example of occlusion in the painting had to be classified as either continuing on the other side of a surface or not. And this is the results. These are all the paintings. And in fact, the majority of the paintings, and these are all painters that are trying to give a realistic impression, in the majority of cases, the occlusion does not continue on the other side of the surface. It's just a one-sided occlusion. Now we call those one-sided occlusion cues paracues, and the cues that involve continuation across the surface we call transcues. And next. And we decided to use shapes to look at this. And the first thing we did, this is an experiment on paracues in which we used both a set of subjective figures with no line, which give a strong subjective contour along the bottom edge, and equivalent figures where there's a line along the bottom edge. And these are actually placed in the order of their choice in the subjective contour experiment, and then these are placed in the order of their choice, this is a paired comparison again, in the occlusion experiment, and you can see that the order is exactly the same in both cases. This is part of the evidence I have for using subjective contours and an index of perceived occlusion. So we got a very high correlation of 0.96 with different subjects in the two experiments, between the probabilities for seeing a subjective contour with these figures and the probabilities for seeing occlusion with these figures. But I think you can see there that the paracues are really very strong. You get quite a strong sense of occlusion for... And next, can I have the next slide, please? So that particularly for the highly entropic set of shapes where they're different in width, orientation and length, there's a very strong probability of them being chosen over all the others. And this is an intermediate degree of entropy. It lacks orientation entropy, but it has entropy of width, height and separation, whereas this is a very low entropic stimulus and it gives a very low probability of choice as an occluder or as a subjective contour in the subjective contour experiment. Next. Okay, so one of the para-Qs is entropy, but it's not the only one. The other Q is extrinsic edge, which I mentioned earlier. So in this case, all of the stimuli are rectangles, and so none of these edges are extrinsic, but they're very well grouped with the rest of the figure, and they're parallel to the other side, they're orthogonal to the sides of the shape. So this figure here, although it has entropy as a para-Q, does not have extrinsic edge. This one has more entropy because it's got orientation entropy as well as entropy of width, length, and separation. But it has the additional Q of the bottom edges all being extrinsic, potentially extrinsic to the rest of their figure. And so that's why I think this is gives such a powerful sense of subjective contour and occlusion. Next. So what we wanted to do was to take these sort of three of the stimuli from our previous experiment, the regular one, the moderately entropic one, and the one with very high entropy, and look at the effect of them singly on subjective contour strength, and compare that with the same subjective contour strength with the same upper edge, but when there are trans Qs added, that is Qs that are for occlusion based on continuation across the surface, does that add to the subjective contour strength? And we also looked at the degree to which the second set had to be relatable. What if they're not continuous across the surface? They could still increase perceived occlusion and subjective contour simply by specifying the surface better, giving more surface support, more support to the idea that there is a surface there. And so this was the basic experiment we did. Next. And we found that adding a second set of inducers in every case, if you compare this one here with this one here, there's a stronger subjective contour with the two sets of inducers. Similarly, for this one here, this one here and this one here, there's an increased subjective contour. But it was equally true of the unrelatable ones. So here's the relatable trans Q condition and the unrelatable, and they give the same result. And here too, here's the relatable trans Q condition for the moderate entropy lines, and it's the same when they're unrelatable. So we concluded that relatability across a gap didn't really matter. It was important. It helped to have two sets of inducers, but they didn't have to be relatable across a gap. However, next, there's some conflicting evidence in the literature about this point. This is a study by He and Uy on the illusory O, and they found that when the inducers for the illusory O became unrelatable, the strength of the O declined. And so that was in conflict with our finding that relatability didn't really matter. Next. So we decided to do an experiment in which we varied gap size. So we had relatable trans Qs and unrelatable ones. We had large gap, medium gap, and small gap here, but we only actually used two gap sizes in the experiment, this one and this one. But you can see, I think, from this demonstration that when the gap's small, there does seem to be a disruptive effect of unrelatability, which is not present when the gap's larger. And so it's impossible that whether relatability was important or not depended upon the gap size. Next. And so here's an experiment in which we varied gap size, and indeed we found it was to be the case that for large gaps there was some effect of making the trans-Q is unrelatable. But it was a fairly small effect. However, for the small gap, these small gaps here, there's a much bigger effect. And here's a small gap condition for the high entropy inducers. So in fact, what we found was that relatability mattered for small gaps, but really not very much for large gaps. Next. And we also looked at polarity change, because when you change the polarity of inducers across the gap, I mean, Hay and Uwe had found that this greatly disrupted the illusory O, and so we thought that polarity change might also be a factor that only matters for small gaps. And so here we didn't use any single inducers here. Just a minute. I think the battery's run out of this thing. Anyway, I'll try and do without it. So we have the large gap is shown in black and the small gap is shown in grey, and the conditions, all black and white, are conditions where there isn't any polarity change across the gap. And the condition which says polarity change is the one where there's polarity change across the gap. And you can see that it's only for the small gap that has a profound effect. It has a bit of an effect for the large gap, as shown by the black bars, but a very much bigger effect for the small gap. So that supports the point that factors which Her and Uwe had found and destroyed the illusory O, also tended to destroy subjective contours in our experiment, but only for the small gap. Next. Now, I think that this has some very interesting implications. I speculate that small gap conditions force attention to trans-gap relations. So when you've got a small gap, you can't really ignore the relationship between the inducers across the gap. And that has two consequences. One consequence is that trans-Qs with amodal completion have a strong influence on perceived occlusion at small gaps, because you can't ignore them, and if they're present, then they have a big influence, and if they're absent, then it's very disruptive. The second consequence, though, is that attention to trans-gap relations is to the detriment of the para-Qs along each edge. So with a small gap, you can't ignore the trans-Qs, and you tend to pay less attention to the para-Qs along the edge. With the large gap, the para-Qs are much more dominant. And the para-Qs are more effective than the trans-Qs. And in fact, if we go back to the, could you just go back to the slide that has the, well, actually, I think you could go back to the one that 2 slides back. The other factor here, this is working again. The other factor here, which is interesting, is that in every case, large gaps give stronger subjective contours than small gaps, both for relatable and for unrelatable conditions. Relatable and unrelatable. The large gap in every case gives a stronger subjective contour. Next slide, please. And so this is also true here, that that the large gap always gives the stronger subjective contour. And so to go back to my point, if I can have the next slide, what I think this shows is that large gaps produce a stronger sense of occlusion and subjective contours because only large gaps allow the paracues to dominate the transcues, and the paracues are more important and more effective in producing sense of occlusion than transcues. So basically, the conclusion in this research on the two kinds of occlusion cues is that most occlusion does not involve continuation across the surface. It's basically controlled by occlusion cues on one side of the surface. And these experiments that we've just done show that those cues are indeed more effective than transcues which allow for amodal completion. Okay, so I think that I'll stop there and for a break, and when I come back I'll talk about stereopsis and art. Stereopsis and I'll talk about art, not stereopsis and art. I'll talk about some of the things that I've already talked about in this half of the talk. I'll try and relate to art, and particularly I'll talk about Australian Aboriginal painting, which has become a major interest of mine, and it's very interesting from a perceptual point of view because it uses occlusion in a very pure kind of way. It's not really realistic art, but it's trying to get certain visual effects. And I think it's very, very interesting from the point of view of looking at occlusion factors. But the other thing that I'll do is to talk about some Renaissance art in relation to Kanizsa's point that occlusion is a perceptual effect in art and not a cognitive effect. Now, could everybody get a set of glasses? They're up on the table at the back there, the red-green glasses. Because in the second part of the talk, I'll try and show some anaglyphs. I now want to move on to the third part of my talk on stereoscopic occlusion perception. And then I'll move on to the fourth part of my talk on art. I'm going to make three main points about stereoscopic occlusion perception. The first is that poorly grouped high entropy shapes, which I've already shown you, when occluded, produce the richest disparity information for occlusion and subjective contours in depth. And I hope that I'll be able to show you that with some anaglyphs. Not sure they'll work, however, we've had some trouble with them. Secondly, I'll show how the manipulation of spatial layout by stereo means can rule out image-based models of subjective contours. And thirdly, I'll show how the properties of groups of lines can discriminate between binocular occlusion and binocular slant.
If you want, that one is light.
Okay. Thank you. Binocular occlusion and binocular slant, which can produce the same horizontal disparities for horizontal individual lines. So again, this is a way in which grouping works, but in binocular vision. Next, please. Next. How many people here can free fuse? Okay. The reason I ask is that I'm not sure. I've got an anaglyph of this, but I'm not sure it'll work. So these are free fusion versions, the left and right image of the three figures that you've already come across in the earlier part of my talk. At the top we have a set of shapes which have very low entropy, all regular. In the middle we have the moderate entropy shapes, and at the bottom the high entropy shapes. Now if you can free fuse, you should try and fuse those. Can anyone do that? If you fuse the top set, the middle set and the bottom set. And basically what you'll find is that the bottom set gives a very strong sense of a subjective contour in depth standing out in front of the shapes. That's how it differs from the monocular subjective contour, which is already quite strong. And anyway, so I don't know whether you can see that. We have the next slide, that's the anaglyph. We'll see if it works. Does it work? You should, this is the high entropy set, and you should, if it works, see a subjective contour standing out in depth at on the bottom diagonal edge. Does anyone see it? I don't know. I can't tell from up here really. No, don't bother. I don't think it's going to work. I'm sorry. It worked on the computer, but it doesn't seem to work on the projector. Okay. Anyway, I'll have to describe what's happening here. Next slide, please. No, sorry. I'll go back to. Can you go back 2 slides? Yeah. Okay. So what we did here was to try to substantiate the monocular work, showing that this figure gives a much stronger subjective contour than this one, and this one gives a stronger one than this one. I did this with Bart Anderson, and our initial motive in doing this research was to provide a completely objective way of showing how powerful this entropy factor was in producing subjective contours. And we thought that we could do this by doing a binocular experiment. And so we tilted these figures 45 degrees, as you can see. And for each of them, we attenuated one image along the diagonal. You can see how this is attenuated relative to this along the diagonal. Likewise, this is attenuated relative to this, and this is attenuated relative to that. Now, attenuating one image along the diagonal in that way is the equivalent in the real world to putting a diagonal occluder in depth along that diagonal. And the degree of attenuation is related to the degree of depth, because this attenuation produces both horizontal and vertical disparities. And vertical disparities are quite important for seeing occlusion in stereo. And so our initial thought was that it would be good to be able to show that this has a lower threshold for detecting the depth step along the bottom diagonal than this, and that this has a lower threshold than this. That was our original idea. The way in which we measured the depth threshold was in a 2 alternative force choice task. We showed one of these pairs, we got the threshold for each of these separately, but say we were doing this one. We showed a pair with a particular degree of attenuation, followed by a pair with no attenuation, which should have no depth step. And the subject had to say in which interval they saw the depth step. And then we varied the degree of attenuation between trials. And on every trial, the subject had to say which interval was the depth step. And that way we could get a threshold for seeing the depth step for each of these figures. And can I have the next? You can skip over the anaglyph and go to the next slide. And so these were the data for all 6 subjects. The threshold for the most regular of the stimuli was the highest. The one with intermediate entropy was the next highest, and the one with high entropy had a very low threshold for seeing the depth step. So in fact, the experiment worked in that we were able to produce an entirely objective way of demonstrating the power of the entropy contrast factor in perceiving occlusion, this time with binocular occlusion. Next slide. However, and what's really interesting about this is that binocular entropy has a very interesting effect on disparity. What this shows is the way in which horizontal disparity varies with the orientation of the inducer in a 45-degree occlude. These are 45-degree occlude. We're assuming the occlude is at 45 degrees, and we're assuming that in the high entropy condition that there are a number of different orientations of the inducers. Now you can see that both horizontal and vertical disparity at that 45-degree diagonal vary with the orientation of the inducer. And so for any given orientation, deviation from the perpendicular, maybe I should go back 2 slides again so these are all at different orientations. So every one of those different orientations will have a different combination of horizontal and vertical disparity, because both of those disparities vary with orientation and differently with orientation. So there's a kind of binocular entropy as well as a monocular entropy. So that this figure here, which has the very low threshold, also has a great variety of horizontal and vertical disparity combinations along the edge. And so it's particularly interesting that it has such a low threshold, because it involves the visual system in really putting together a lot of very complex information. Can I go forward 2 slides? And the next slide. So why do these shapes with orientation entropy have the lowest depth threshold, despite the great complexity of the pattern of disparities? Well, perhaps it's because the depth accounts for all the disparity combinations at once. Now, there is a process like this which is called explaining away in Bayesian network theory. And in Bayesian terms, when multiple different observations are all consistent with a particular decision of an outcome, then that decision is considerably strengthened. So I think that this experiment, although it's very difficult to tease apart the effect of the monocular entropy and the effect of the binocular entropy, I think that at least the binocular entropy is not having a detrimental effect, and it seems to be having a powerful effect on stereo threshold. So I suspect that it's this kind of a process. Next slide. Now the next topic I want to talk about is depth occlusion at abutting lines. Now in the theory of subjective contours, abutting lines are a major stimulus that's used to theorise about. There's a strong subjective contour here, and in this case, when the lines are interdigitated, the subjective contour disappears. Now, the physiological theories of subjective contours are very keen on this stimulus, because they're all based upon end-stopped cells, and the integration of end-stopping along these abutting lines, can be modelled as a very strong determinant of subjective contours based on end stopping. And also that the models predict the weak subjective contour here. But is this always the case? I mean, this is what happens monocularly. But what if we keep the image constant, but we change the surface depth grouping and the depth order, and we manipulate those stereoscopically? What does that do to the subjective contour? Next slide. Now again, if you can free fuse, I've got an anaglyph of this which probably works, but if you can free fuse, what these are stereograms. This is if you cross fuse this pair or uncross fuse this pair. What this is equivalent to is you can see that they're all abutting monocularly, but stereoscopically, the bottom set of lines, when fused, either cross-fused here or uncross-fused here, are in front of the top set of lines. They're nearer, stereoscopically. If you can free fuse, you can see that. Now, there's a second difference between the top set and the bottom set. The top set of lines I call the forest, because not only are they further than the bottom set, but they're also at a number of different depths, so I call them the forest. I call the bottom set the plane because they are planar. And so you can't see the different depths of the forest here, but this is the plane, it's all in the same depth, lines at the same depth. This is the forest, the lines are at different depths. And what you should see if you free fuse these, you should see the plane in front of the forest with a very strong subjective contour, stronger than in the monocular case where they abut. Now, well, let's try the anaglyph and see if it works. Now, for this anaglyph, you should reverse the glasses. So the red should be on the right eye, and the green should be on the left eye. Now the top one, if you reverse the glasses so that the green's on the left eye, you should see what I've just described. This is the plane and this is the forest. You should see the plane nearer than the forest and cutting off the contours of the forest, the forest has lines at different depths. Did you see that? Oh, good. Great, it worked. That's terrific. Okay. Now turn the glasses around the other way, so the red is on the left eye as they're made to be, and you should see the forest nearer than the plane, and the subjective contour disappears. Do you see that? When the forest comes nearer than the plane, the subjective contour disappears. Does anyone see that? Yeah. Now, why is that? I mean, here we've got the situation I described where the image is the same, the image is still abut. But in the one case, when the plane is nearer than the forest, we have a strong subjective contour, and when the forest is nearer than the plane, the contour disappears. Well, a forest cannot be an occluder. A forest is a whole lot of lines at different depths. It's not a surface. It cannot be an occluder, and you don't get occlusion, and you don't get a subjective contour. Okay, now put the glasses back the wrong way round again, so that the green's on the left eye. And now look at the next anaglyph here. And again, the plane is nearer than the forest, but the plane is separated from the forest. It's somewhat separated from the forest. Now, this anaglyph was made by Ken Nakayama, my colleague, and the separation is a bit greater than it was in our original paper, but I think it still works. You should see the plane still occludes the forest, and the subjective contour is not along the edge of the plane, it's along the edge of the forest. And the plane actually moves beyond its endpoints to meet the forest. Do you see that? And if you have it now in the bottom one, I don't know why I'm having trouble with this pointer. And at the bottom one, they'd interdigitated. Now this is the situation in which is always demonstrated monocularly as destroying the subjective contour, but it doesn't destroy the subjective contour. What you see now is the plane is still in front of the forest, and a subjective contour appears along the bottom of the forest, because these kind of stereo manipulations show is that a subjective contour is along the occluded elements, not along the occluding elements, and you can't really tell that from monocular studies, but you can tell it from doing these stereo manipulations. So in this case, you see the subjective contour along the edge of the forest. That means it's cutting off the ends of the lines of the plane. Do you see that? The ends of the lines of the plane are sticking out beyond the subjective contour, in this case. Does anyone see? How many people can see that? Oh, good. Good. Okay. Next slide. Oh, yeah, we don't need that one, no. That's the same. That's what we've just seen. Oh, no, I know. Go back to the yellow slide again. There's one more thing I want to show you. Oh, no, sorry. No, it's okay. Just continue, but not the next one, but the next one. 2 on. No, not that one either. Okay. Now, this is another interesting thing about this. This was a study we did in which people had to rate subjects, these 4 subjects, 3 of whom were naive, had to rate the strength of subjective contour along these different conditions. The forest alone, the plane alone, the forest far, with the plane near, and this was in the abutting condition, and the forest near with the plane far. And this confirms the observations that I just demonstrated with the anaglyphs, that the forest near has a very weak subjective contour compared to when the forest far and the plane's near. Now, but the interesting thing is that there's no, gosh. I don't seem to be able to get this to work. The interesting thing here is that the forest alone doesn't give you a strong subjective contour. The plane has to be present, even though the plane does not in any way delineate the subjective contour. The subjective contour is always along the edge of the forest, but if the forest presented alone, there isn't a good subjective contour there. There's hardly any subjective contour there. So they're both necessary. Can I have the next slide, please? Now this shows the effects of an experiment in which we had people set a probe to where they saw the subjective contour, and again I can't use this. Sorry, I don't seem to be able to. Anyway, you can see that the dotted line, the dotted diagonal line, is the edge of the plane, the one that's pointing down to the right, and the one that's pointing up to the right is the edge of the forest for there's 4 subjects here. And that you can see that subjects always set the probe at the edge of the forest, and on one side, it's on the left of the intersection of the two diagonals are conditions where the forest and the plain are separated, and on the right of the intersection of those diagonals is when they're interdigitated, and you can see that the people still set the probe at the edge of the forest, and whether there's interdigitation or separation up to a certain, I mean, after there's a certain separation at which it won't work, and certain interdigitation where it won't work, but up for quite a few minutes of arc anyway, you still get the subjective contour along the edge of the forest, even though the forest and the plain are separated. Can I have the next slide, please? So these observations locate subjective contour formation at the level at which scene layout is determined, not at the image level. Although the nearer plane is necessary, the subjective contour is not determined by the edge of the plane. It is always at the ends of the occluded lines of the forest, despite the fact that the forest has varying depth and the plane has all the same depth. The subjective contour lies along the edge of the forest, but the forest alone does not produce a strong subjective contour. Now, this is interesting because the forest alone should produce a strong subjective contour according to any theories of perception that claim perception is a process of avoiding coincidence or accidental views, because the forest lines are all at different depths, but they're all lined up. And that would only occur if the eye level was exactly at the bottom of the lines of the forest. And that's a highly accidental view and should produce a strong subjective contour for the forest alone. And this would also be the case on, I think, on a Bayesian explanation, that you should see a subjective contour along the lines of the forest. But as in many situations, in my experience, involving subjective contours, surface support is often a very important factor. It's not enough to just have minimal information, even though that might be the most likely one. You often need something more, and in this case, it's surface support from the plane. Next slide, please. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in relation to stereo is how it's possible to resolve stereo ambiguity with multiple lines. This shows a situation in which this is a bird's eye view of two eyes looking at a slant. And when you look at a slanted surface in stereopsis, the eye that's on the side of the away side of the slant always has the larger image. And you can, and the images are shown at the bottom here. I don't know. However, for a single line, you can get exactly identical images from an occluder. So you can see that if you have an occluder in that position, it's going to, the occluder on the right side is attenuating the right-hand image in exactly the same way as it's attenuated for a single line with a slant. So the left eye sees more than the right eye because it's seeing around the occluder. Next slide, please. So if an occluder is on the right side, the left eye should see more. And the occluder will truncate the same linear amount from the right image for all the lines. This shows the two images. And the occluder is occluding the same linear amount from the right image for all the lines. Now slant, on the other hand, produces a disparity that is not a linear constant, it is proportional to line width. So if you have multiple lines as opposed to just a single line, you can disambiguate these two situations. You can discriminate between them. If the disparities across the set of lines are a constant linear amount across the set, it's an occlusion. If the difference between the line widths for the set of lines is proportional, then it's a slant. Now, if the occluder is on the right side and the right eye sees more, this is invalid for occlusion, and each line is then processed separately and multiple slants are seen. So if the disparity is on the wrong eye, if the wider image is on the wrong eye, then occlusion is not possible, so each line is then processed individually according to its individual disparity. And of course, a constant attenuation of one eye's view is a different proportion for each line width, so that's why you get different slants in this invalid situation. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, now, if you don't have an actual physical occluder there, you still can see an occlusion if you've got the right kind of set of linear attenuations of one eye's view of the multiple lines. And the criteria that has occurred are the presence of a subjective contour along the aligned edge and the absence of slant in the disparate lines, because the disparity is attributed to the occluder and not to the lines. The next slide, please. I don't know whether this will work. This should look like an occluder in depth standing out in front of the lines. Does anyone see that? No? Next slide. Next slide. Well, if you can free fuse, you can free fuse this one. Now, this is a situation where there's a graded attenuation of one eye's line widths. And what you see if you fuse these is a subjective contour coming out in depth, or like actually diagonally coming out in depth, which I'm not sure you can see if you because most people can't pre-fuse. So there's a graded truncation of line lengths in one eye's view. It signals a slanted subjective contour in depth. It comes out at you. Does anyone see that? Oh, good. Good. Okay, well, since you saw that one, I'll show you another one, which is even more fun. Can I have the next slide, please? Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Oh. I think there's one missing there. Can you just go back again? Oh, yes, that one, yes. If you saw the other one, this is even more fun. This has actually got a doubly curved occluder in depth. But I don't know whether you can see it, because I'm not sure it works with the anaglyphs. Does anyone? No, it probably doesn't work. Okay. Next slide then. Okay, so the summary of this disambiguation work on stereo. The source of a disparity cannot be determined for an individual horizontal line, but it can be done by comparing lines of different widths. And this is another example of entropy proving useful and giving information that regular stimuli don't provide. And what is interesting here is that processing multiple lines for occlusion involves the matching stage of stereopsis. So it's not just a high-level interpretation of matched images matched at a low level, because in the case of occlusion, such as here, where you've got an attenuation of the lines on the right because the occluder's on the right, only the left sides of these images match. The right side should not be matched because they're from different spatial locations. This is an occlusion situation. The right side should not be matched. Once the visual system has somehow decided this is an occlusion, matching must not occur for the lines on that side. The disparity is attributed to an occluder in depth. The actual lines themselves should not be matched. Whereas for processing slant, both sides are matched. Because slant is a disparity between the ends of one line and the ends of the other line. And so this is really quite complicated stuff. And the mind boggles at the kind of processing that the visual system has to go through in order to arrive at this solution. This is really one of the reasons why I think that a lot of theories are just too simple. The actual logic behind some of these situations is really quite, like, for example, the logic in the paper that Ken Nakayama and I published on the forest and the plain. We have a complicated diagram about all the logical steps that are required in order to see the subjective contour only when the plain's nearer than the forest and so on. I mean, it's a major achievement, and it's similar here, so that the visual system somehow is able to detect the occlusion situation on the basis of whether there's a linear accretion to one set of lines or a proportional one, and then the matching follows from that. Okay, now I'll just go on to the art. I have the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, now I want to just use a couple of slides from medieval painting to illustrate the point, A, that perception is important in occlusion and that cognition isn't enough, and secondly, to show how in painting a lot of the cues that I've already talked about are used. Now in this painting here, which is by Bembo Bonifacio, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, this woman with the red dress actually looks like a mermaid or someone very long and thin. She doesn't really look occluded because there's no occlusion. There are no occlusion cues on her robe. She looks very strange. Whereas on the other hand, if you have a look at this, this woman here, on the right, on the left, and I can't see very well from where I am, but you can see that there's orientation contrast there. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that would be great help. Oh, okay. Okay, so this is the woman I'm talking about who looks long and thin, and whereas here you can see a very clear occlusion because of orientation contrast. Here you can see a very clear occlusion because of orientation contrast, and so you can see that in painting it's not enough to know cognitively that woman is occluded. I mean, it's clear that she's meant to be, but that doesn't really help you. Next slide, please. This is another painting from it's from Siena, Ambrogio Lorenzetti, and I just wanted to show this because of the use of halos, and halos are very common in art of this period, and halos are tremendously useful not only to show that people are holy, but also to show to give very good curvature and entropy contrast, much better than the head without a halo would do. A head without a halo is a somewhat messy looking thing and small, whereas a halo is large and beautifully curved and provides excellent curvature contrast with linear details in the background and excellent entropy contrast with multifarious details in the background. The placement on the ground plane helps occlusion to some degree by just simply placing people at different depths. Next slide, please. And that becomes important here. This is from Duccio's Maesta series from Siena. And St. Peter here is warming his feet by the fire. And cognitively, of course, one knows if you're warming your feet by the fire, your feet are not going to be on the ground. And so, he should appear to be just sitting on his seat and warming his feet by the fire. But in fact, he appears to be sort of floating in midair because he's not located on the ground, and there's just really no cues about where he is. I mean, there's no good occlusion cues between him and the next people. He's next to them. And so he's not anchored, and he kind of floats, and knowing what he's doing doesn't really help. But you can also see all sorts of examples here of entropy contrast and so on from his halo and so on. Now, have a look at the picture at the top. Look at all these heads. Is there anything odd that you notice about this picture? Well, what is odd about it is that most of those heads don't have any feet. And Duccio obviously was lazy, and he just couldn't be bothered doing feet because he was perfectly aware of the fact that people wouldn't notice if he didn't paint the feet. At least that's my theory. Because without scrutiny, you just simply don't notice. I mean, you just don't relate the number of heads here to the number of feet here. And cognitively, this should be a disaster, but it's perceptually, it doesn't really matter because you just don't pay attention to these simultaneously. You see this and you see this, and you just don't put them together. Next slide, please. Now this is an interesting one too. This is also by Duccio's Maesta series, and there are two completely different scenes here. This is Jesus mocked by the order of Caiaphas here, and this is St. Peter's third denial here. And it looks like a coherent scene when you just look at it, and it's only with scrutiny that you realise that these two are completely unrelated scenes. And this is partly because of what I said earlier, that paracues to occlusion are really the most important, and they're quite successful here. So you see this is successfully occluded, and the fact that there aren't any trans cues doesn't really seem to matter. Similarly, this is successfully seen as occluded by the pillar. And so there's a violation of trans-pillar continuation, but it's just not noticed, at least not at first. I mean, when you scrutinise the painting, you do start to realise it. But this is a very good example of how these early painters, were really quite dominated by what they could get away with perceptually. Duccio didn't seem to mind at all a cognitive contradiction, as long as it was perceptually successful. Now I have the next slide, please. Now I want to talk about Australian Aboriginal painting. Next slide, please. occlusion in Australian Aboriginal painting. Now this is quite early. A lot of these paintings are by Morland Marika, who was a pioneer of bark painting. And what you see here is a goanna against a pattern which is the clan design of the Marika family. And the goanna, you can see, has relatable details on either side of it. Now this is the goanna's track, and it does not have related, a lot of the details are not related there. And I think it's probably because, I'm trying to second guess him here, but I think it's probably because the track of the goanna disturbs the ground. Now an interesting thing about Australian Aboriginal art is that the actual ground is really important in Australian Aboriginal art. It's very different from the ground in Western art, which is like a background. But in Australian Aboriginal art, I mean, a great deal of attention is paid to the ground because that was really important in their culture. Can I have the next slide, please? Now this is another painting by Morland in which he introduces orientation contrast. And there's various examples of that, which gives a much stronger sense of occlusion than just the regular clan design with orthogonal lines. Okay. The next slide, please. Now, in this case, he started introducing nested occlusions. Nested occlusions, one occlusion on top of another on top of another, and that gives a very good sense of depth, which is quite important in Australian Aboriginal art because they don't have linear perspective and they get depth effects through nested occlusions, and this was quite a pioneering use of nested occlusions. Now snakes are very common, partly because they were common in the Australian outback, but also because they give a wonderful sense of curvature contrast with linear backgrounds. Oh, it doesn't work. The snakes give a very good curvature contrast against rectilinear backgrounds, as I said. And they also tend to appear as figures and also as holes. There's something quite sinister about the effect of the snakes. But you can see how important orientation contrast is in this kind of early Australian Aboriginal bark painting. Have the next slide, please. Now this is another painting by Morland. He's one of my favourite painters, in which the goanna's tails merge with the background and deliberately merge with the background. And this is quite symbolic, I think. It shows that the creature is sort of the earth, as it were. And this represents a journey from one waterhole to another and then back again. And that's curved, and it appears to occlude the background, which is the clan design, and which is I think this is the more permanent. The clan design represents the more permanent features of the landscapes, the sand hills, sand dunes, and so on. And the journey is the less permanent feature of the scene, and that occludes the more permanent aspects of the ground. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, this is an interesting one because these are buffaloes, which are feral animals, and you can see that the buffaloes have completely mucked everything up. I mean, they've just destroyed any sense of coherence to the scene whatsoever. There's no really good sense of occlusion and figure ground or anything. Whereas the parts of the painting that involve Australian animals not feral animals, are very orderly and have very good sort of occlusion, largely based on actually things on figure ground features, actually, like parallelism versus irregular backgrounds, and convexity is important. And the background doesn't continue on the other side of the figure, but that doesn't seem to matter because the convex figures of these animals, or parallel figures, are enough to make them appear to occlude the ground. The next slide, please. Oh, this is just showing the power of parallelism, which was very often used in early Aboriginal painting. The snakes are always parallel, and so they are seen as figure, and the irregular areas are seen as ground. Next slide, please. Oh, this is the most famous of the bark painters, David Malangi. He actually has a painting on one of the Australian notes. I think it's the $5 note. And this shows a very skilled kind of use of occlusion, largely based on good continuation. But it's a beautiful painting, very sophisticated, really. The way in the use of the way in which the space is filled. Okay, next slide, please. Now this is a painting, another bark painting, in which they're kind of playing with occlusion cues. I mean, here, this is an occluder, but it's deliberately painted to be completely in line with the elements of the background. So there's a sort of a tension there. And this one is occluded, and it's also painted so that its edges are completely in line with the background. So one feels as though there's a kind of deliberate tension produced in that painting for artistic purposes. The occlusion and occluded, not quite fully realised, but sort of with a tension involving their interaction with backgrounds. Next one. Now this is a common feature of Australian Aboriginal painting. Unlike Western painting, the background is not always, or not usually even, devoid of shape, which of course we were always taught that the ground is. The ground doesn't have shape, and it goes behind the figure. That's not the case necessarily in Australian Aboriginal painting. And I think the reason for this, it could just be for no very good reason, that they're just doing it for fun, but I think that it's partly to do with the culture, that the ground, as I said, is very important to them, and noticing features of the ground and noticing how things on the ground change the look of the ground and so on. So the ground in Australian Aboriginal painting, unlike in Western painting, is not something at a different distance and just a backdrop. I mean, it is something with important features in itself, which you have to take notice of in order to see what's going on. The next slide, please. Now, I now wanted to show you some of the Central Desert Papunya paintings. These are extraordinarily interesting because in the 70s there was a group of people from the Central Desert who were forced to leave their traditional lands because of white people taking waterholes and polluting waterholes with their animals and that sort of thing. And these people were all brought to a rather miserable town called Papunya in the middle of Australia, very kind of demoralised, having lost their own land and lost their culture, and they sort of sat around doing nothing much. And there was a school there, and an art teacher at the school Geoffrey Barden, who was an Englishman, was teaching the children to paint, and he had acrylic paints. And some of these men who had come in from the desert and had nothing much to do started to paint with acrylics. And to cut a long story short, their paintings have become an international sensation. Some of them get huge sums. It's extraordinary that these people with no experience with painting at all, came up with such wonderful kinds of works. And I'm going to show you some of them because they have a lot of occlusion information. Can I have the next slide, please? This is one of the paintings that I mentioned that were done by the first generation of these men that were brought in from the desert. It's called Water Dreaming. And you can see how nested occlusions are used extremely successfully with their orientation and curvature contrasts. And I think this is a brilliant painting, not just because of the occlusions, but it just does really give a fantastic sense of flowing water, and the colours also give a sense of the water. I mean, these paintings are quite remarkable. One wonders how these men could have done it. They were nearly all extremely good paintings. Can I have the next one? This one's called Men Travelling in a Bushfire. And here you can see nested occlusions and also looming. And the looming is partly produced by the nested occlusions and partly by a size gradient. But this painting also gives a tremendous sense of menace, which you would get from an advancing bushfire. Okay, the next one. This is one of my favourite ones. I mean, I think this is incredibly atmospheric. I mean, you can see this oval shape, which has very different colours, and which has sort of terminators around the edge, rather like an Ehrenstein illusion. You can see it as an occluder, but I think that much more one tends to see it as an aperture, and one tends to see through an aperture a whole other world beyond, with completely different features, different colours, different contrast, everything. I think that's a terrific painting. And you'll notice the subjective contours along the edge. I don't think these men had read Kanizsa. But in fact, you find subjective contours even in 19th century rock paintings sometimes in Australia. There are very old rock paintings which have this effect. Can I see the next one? Now, Clifford Possum is one of the painters that I mentioned who fetches enormous prices at auction. And what he does is to paint the ground through hazes of smoke and clouds. And you can see sort of piecemeal the ground features beneath. And a lot of them are too far apart to really amodally complete. It almost is more like a cognitive completion in many cases. But it's very effective. Next one, please. Here's another Clifford Possum with even more fragmented ground seen through a sort of haze of something like smoke and ash and so forth. This one is another example of where the ground is delineated, as I mentioned earlier, in a way that's... The one I showed earlier was a bark painting, and this is a Central Desert painting, but they're delineating the ground. And here we have connectivity between waterholes and between either... I don't know quite what these are, how different these are different from these, and I'm not sure what they are, but you can see that the grouping principle of connectivity is shown here. Can I have the next one, please? This is another one where the ground is delineated, and it's delineated by very starkly, highly contrast white outlines, and it has the appearance of translucency. You feel as though there's a light shining through there, and that's partly produced by the high contrast and by medium contrast surrounding it, I think. Anyway, it's quite remarkable. The next one. Okay, this is a modern painting from the Central Desert, but much more modern. And you can see again that there's a lot of orientation contrast, curvature contrast, and tremendous number of subjective contours. There's lots of those. Subjective contours are very common now in Aboriginal painting. Okay, the next one. Okay, so Aboriginal painters lack linear perspective, but they convey depth vividly through occlusion relations. They show a good understanding of 2D occlusion cues. The ground is more important to them than vistas. And the ground is, as I said, not distant background as in Western art, so much as revealed actual ground, which is often delineated. They use occlusion, I think, symbolically, abstractly and playfully, as well as realistically, and probably spiritually, although this is difficult for an outsider really to know. They keep the spiritual meaning of the paintings, very, very much hidden, especially from women. Okay, thank you.